nightscape on. What do you see? A tapestry of twinkling stars, a silent and peaceful cosmic ocean. We have been conditioned to look at the heavens with a sense of wonder and safety. We imagine the universe as a quiet backdrop to the drama of human existence. But that silence is a lie. It is not the silence of a peaceful slumber. It is the silence of a loaded gun. Over the past 4.5 billion years, the entity we call Earth has been sitting in the crosshairs of a ruthless, uncaring cosmos. 5 times the universe has handed down a definitive death sentence to almost everything breathing, crawling, or swimming on this pale blue dot. 5 times the slate was nearly wiped completely clean in a theater of unimaginable slaughter. We always think of ourselves as the ultimate survivors, the pinnacle of evolution. Yet the very fact that you and I are here breathing today is not a testament to our strength. It is a testament to the greatest, most desperate heist in the history of existence, pulled off by a lineage of creatures no bigger than your thumb who somehow managed to cheat the Reaper. How did they do it? How did life crawl out of the ashes of 5 apocalyptic hellscapes? To understand the magnitude of our survival, we must first look into the eyes of the absolute destruction that tried to erase us. We must travel back to the very first time the universe decided that life on Earth had grown a little too arrogant. Imagine a world entirely alien to the one you know. We are dialing the clock back 440 million years. Welcome to the Ordovician period. Do not look for lush green forests or roaming beasts. The continents are completely barren, lifeless expanses of desolate rock, scoured by relentless winds. But plunge beneath the surface of the sprawling global ocean and you will find a metropolis of staggering complexity. The shallow, sunlit waters are boiling with an explosion of biological diversity. This is the golden age of the arthropods and the mollusks. Picture massive coral reefs, not like the ones we have today, but bizarre sponge-like structures painting the seafloor in vibrant, intoxicating colors. Schools of jawless fish dart through the warm currents. Giant sea scorpions patrol the sandy bottoms, their massive claws snapping at shadows. And ruling over this underwater paradise are the orthocones, terrifying predators with conical shells up to 30 feet long, jetting through the water like biological torpedoes. It is a world of endless summer, a bustling, thriving ecosystem where life has finally figured out how to conquer the oceans. They are safe under the blanket of the atmosphere. They are multiplying. They are evolving. They are completely oblivious to the fact that their executioner has already pulled the trigger. You think light is the ultimate symbol of life. We are taught to fear the dark, to seek the warmth of the sun, to equate brightness with safety and salvation. But the truth is a blinding flash of light from the deepest, darkest corner of the cosmos stripped the life from 85% of this planet in a fraction of a second. Far beyond the boundaries of our Milky Way, in a galaxy so distant its name does not matter, a massive star reached the end of its life. It did not just burn out. It collapsed in upon itself with a gravitational violence so extreme that it tore a hole in the fabric of space and time, giving birth to a black hole. As the star died, its dying breath was not a whimper, but a cosmic scream. It channeled the energy of 1 billion suns into 2 hyper-focused beams of pure, unadulterated radiation. This is a gamma ray burst, the deadliest, most energetic phenomenon since the Big Bang itself. It is the sniper rifle of the universe. And 440 million years ago, Earth happened to wander directly into its line of sight. Because this beam of concentrated death is made of light, it travels at the exact speed of light. There is no warning. There is no slow buildup of atmospheric pressure. There is no tremor in the ground. The creatures swimming in the warm Ordovician seas did not feel a change in the current. The giant predators did not sense a shift in the magnetic field. One moment the world was a vibrant tapestry of survival and hunting. The next moment the sky detonated. An invisible silent shockwave of gamma radiation slammed into the upper atmosphere of the Earth. Within seconds, the blast ripped apart the ozone layer, the invisible shield that had protected the delicate biology below from the harshness of space. The shield was not just broken, it was shattered into atmospheric dust. Instantly, a lethal cocktail of ultraviolet radiation from our own sun poured down upon the oceans without any filter. The very light that fed the microscopic phytoplankton at the base of the food chain suddenly became toxic. It was a sunburn on a planetary scale. The immediate impact was horrific, but the true nightmare unfolded in the slow, agonizing decades that followed. With the ozone layer gone, the phytoplankton began to mutate and die by the trillions. The foundation of the entire global ecosystem crumbled into dust. The majestic orthocones, the armored trilobites, the bustling reefs, they all began to starve. The oceans turned into a graveyard of rotting organic matter. The decomposition sucked the oxygen out of the water, suffocating everything that had not already starved to death. The skies darkened with a thick, toxic smog of nitrogen dioxide blocking out the sun and plunging the planet into a sudden, vicious ice age. Glaciers swallowed the continents, draining the shallow seas where the vibrant reefs once thrived, leaving the survivors stranded in freezing, poisonous puddles. 85% of all marine species vanished forever, erased, deleted by an assassin they never saw from a star they never knew existed. This is the existential terror of the universe. It does not hate us. It does not plan our demise. It is simply unimaginably large, incredibly violent, and entirely indifferent to the fragile fleshy things clinging to wet rocks. And the most chilling part of the Ordovician extinction is the realization that another gamma-ray burst could be traveling toward Earth right now. It could have been fired a million years ago, silently crossing the infinite void, and because it traveled at the speed of light, we will not know it is here until the very second our sky catches fire. But life battered, frozen, and suffocating in the dark depths of the dying oceans refused to be extinguished completely. The universe had taken its first shot, but the war for Earth had only just begun. Millions of years passed since the cosmos tried to snipe the Earth into oblivion. The surviving life forms, those resilient, desperate bottom feeders clinging to the barren rocks, slowly crawled out of the toxic abyss. They evolved, they adapted, they multiplied. We move forward in time to 365 million years ago. Welcome to the late Devonian period. This is widely known as the Age of Fishes. The oceans have recovered from the cosmic radiation blast and have become a thriving gladiatorial arena of biological engineering. Sea levels are high and the global climate is incredibly warm. Monsters patrol the deep sunlit waters. This is the era of the placoderms, massive, heavily armored fish that rule the food chain with absolute authority. Imagine coming face to face with the Dunkleosteus, a 30-foot apex predator with a skull made of solid interlocking bone plates and jaws that function like hydraulic guillotines capable of snapping a prehistoric shark completely in half. In these vibrant, bustling Devonian seas, life feels invincible once again. But the threat this time did not come from the cold, uncaring vacuum of space. It did not come from a dying star millions of light years away. The assassin of the Devonian period was born right here on Earth. And it is something so utterly ordinary, so fundamentally essential to our modern existence, that its role as a global executioner feels like a sick, twisted joke played by the universe. We are taught from a very young age that green forests are the lungs of the earth. We look at trees as the ultimate symbols of life, the benevolent providers of oxygen, the protectors of the fragile soil, the very foundation of terrestrial ecosystems. We breathe the sweet, crisp air they purify. We build our homes from their wood. But I bet you did not know that 365 million years ago, the very first trees on this planet systematically strangled the entire ocean. Life destroyed life. The evolutionary triumph of one biological kingdom became the agonizing death sentence for another. The Devonian period introduces us to a terrifying cosmic reality. You do not need a rogue asteroid or a supernova to trigger an apocalyptic extinction event. Sometimes a planet can simply choke to death on its own runaway success. Before this era, the continents were still largely barren, silent expanses of dry rock, wind, and dust. But evolution is a relentless, hungry force, always probing, always pushing into the empty voids. Slowly, tentatively, plant life began to colonize the dry land. They started as simple mosses and low-lying liverworts clinging to the wet, muddy edges of the continents. But then a massive biological revolution occurred, the invention of wood and deep, complex root systems. Trees, the first true forest, began to rise from the dirt. Archaeopteris, a bizarre ancient tree with fern-like leaves and a solid woody trunk, spread like wildfire across the supercontinent of Gondwana. From the perspective of the land, this was a magnificent, unprecedented triumph. The earth was finally turning green. A spectacular canopy was forming, capturing sunlight and breathing vast amounts of fresh oxygen into the atmosphere. The sterile, barren rocks were being broken down and transformed into rich, fertile soil. But evolution has no morality. It does not care about ecological balance. It only cares about blind expansion. And this unbridled terrestrial expansion was about to trigger a chain reaction of absolute horror in the seas below. To grow tall and strong, to build those massive trunks and branches, these alien towering Devonian forests needed immense amounts of nutrients. Their deep, powerful roots acted like the tentacles of a subterranean monster plunging deep into the planetary bedrock. They aggressively broke down the ancient stone through an unrelenting process called chemical weathering. As the roots shattered the rock to extract essential minerals like calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus, they fundamentally altered the chemical composition of the earth itself. And then the torrential rains came. The relentless, violent Devonian storms washed millions of tons of these freshly liberated, highly concentrated nutrients out of the newly formed soils. The rivers carried this massive chemical payload and dumped it directly into the shallow, sunlit oceans. To the microscopic plant life of the sea, this sudden, massive influx of food was a banquet of unprecedented proportions. It triggered a biological explosion that would doom the world. Vast, monstrous blooms of algae erupted across the surface of the ocean, stretching for thousands upon thousands of miles. The clear, vibrant coastal waters turned into a thick, putrid, suffocating soup of green slime. At first glance, an explosion of aquatic plant life might seem like a positive thing, but this global algal bloom was an aggressive planetary cancer. As these trillions of microscopic plants lived and died in rapid succession, their microscopic corpses rained down to the ocean floor like a never-ending toxic snowstorm. The bacteria at the bottom of the sea went into an absolute feeding frenzy, consuming the endless shower of dead, rotting algae. But this feast required a massive amount of oxygen. The bacteria multiplied so rapidly and consumed so much oxygen that they literally drained the oceans of breath. The dissolved oxygen levels plummeted to near zero. The oceans became completely anoxic. Think about the slow creeping dread of this anoxic event. It did not happen overnight. It was a psychological and physical torture stretched over hundreds of thousands of years. Generations of marine animals were born into waters that were progressively harder to breathe. Imagine the absolute terror of the Devonian sea creatures. The mighty Dunkleosteus, the undisputed, heavily armored tyrant of the ocean, swimming through an increasingly thick, dark, and suffocating abyss. No matter how powerful its crushing jaws were, it could not bite its way out of an ocean that had lost its air. The massive predators would swim closer and closer to the surface, gasping desperately for the oxygen that was no longer there, their heavy, bony plates weighing them down like anchors of doom. They were physically trapped between the suffocating, oxygen-starved depths and the toxic algae-choked surface. They could not fight an invisible chemical enemy that simply dissolved the breath directly from their gills. Beneath them, the horror grew even worse. The anaerobic bacteria, the only creatures thriving in this nightmare environment, began to produce massive quantities of hydrogen sulfide gas as a byproduct of their digestion. This highly toxic gas bubbled up from the rotting seafloor, turning the water into a literal poison bath. If the lack of oxygen did not kill the struggling marine life, the toxic hydrogen sulfide gas would finish the job. The oceans did not just passively die, they turned actively hostile, bubbling, with the venomous chemistry of a rotting global corpse. The vibrant coral reefs, once teeming with colorful life, turned into bleached, silent skeletal graveyards. The shallow seas transformed into stagnant black pools smelling of rotten eggs and unimaginable death. And above the water, the silence was deafening. The massive green forests continued their silent march across the continents. They did not have brains or malicious intent. They were just biological machines doing what they were programmed to do. The absolute indifference of the terrestrial biome to the immense suffering of the aquatic biome is the true cosmic horror of this era. The giant, bizarre roots of the trees continued to bleed green, toxic runoff into a black, thick, dead ocean. The trees stood tall and triumphant on the land, breathing freely under the sun, completely unaware that their very existence was asphyxiating the mighty titans of the deep. 75% of all species on Earth were systematically eradicated in a slow, agonizing process of mass suffocation. Entire lineages of spectacular armored fish were wiped out forever. their bones settling into the oxygen-starved mud to eventually become the black shale rock formations we mine for oil today. This is the chilling paradox of the Devonian extinction. There were no falling asteroids. There were no exploding stars. It was simply the unstoppable cold-blooded machinery of nature operating without a safety valve. The sweet breath of the forest was the lethal poison of the sea. It forces us to realize that biological success is incredibly fragile. A planet is a delicately balanced equation, and the slightest shift in variables, even a seemingly positive one, like the greening of the continents, can cascade into a global holocaust. The Earth had survived the sniper fire from the cosmos, and it had survived its own suffocating botanical revolution. But the universe was merely warming up. The entity of life had proven it could endure the sudden loss of light and the agonizing loss of air. So for its next horrific act, the cosmos would decide to test if life could survive the melting of the Earth itself. Have you ever wondered what the Earth would look like if it were melted down into a hellish slaughterhouse? Look back 252 million years to the end of the Permian period. You will see a world where the very rock beneath your feet could boil. We have witnessed the universe snipe the oceans with radiation. We have seen the continents suffocate the seas with toxic green life. But nothing, absolutely nothing, can prepare you for the great dying. This is the moment our blue planet essentially flatlined. The universe decided to test the absolute limits of biological endurance by transforming the Earth into a gargantuan, inescapable furnace. Picture the world at the peak of the Permian. There are no separate continents. There is only Pangaea, a single colossal supercontinent stretching from pole to pole surrounded by one massive global ocean called Panthalassa. It is a thriving, brutally competitive world. Vast deserts dominate the interior, but the coastlines and river valleys are teeming with extraordinary life. This is the era of the synapsids, the distant, monstrous ancestors of all mammals. Imagine the gorgonopsid, a terrifying bear-sized predator at the sprawling gait of a reptile and the massive lethal saber teeth of a mammalian killer. They are the undisputed lords of the land. They are fast, intelligent, and lethal. For millions of years, they have ruled Pangaea with brutal efficiency. They feel secure. The earth beneath their heavy paws feels solid, permanent, and eternal. But that solidity is the most devastating illusion ever constructed. The ground is a lie. We build our lives, our empires, and our evolutionary trees on the assumption that the rocky crust of the earth is a permanent foundation. But beneath that paper-thin crust lies a churning, violent ocean of liquid fire. And deep within the mantle, a nightmare of unimaginable proportions was rising. A monstrous plume of superheated magma, a thermal anomaly the size of a continent, was pushing its way up toward the crust of what is now modern-day Siberia. The gorgonopsids hunting in the lush valleys did not feel the vibrations at first. The giant amphibians resting in the swamps did not notice the subtle warming of the mud. But the absolute terror of the Permian extinction is that the planet itself was weaponized against its inhabitants. When the crust finally broke, it did not happen with a single cinematic explosion. It was far worse. The Earth literally unzipped. Massive fissures, thousands of miles long, tore open across the Siberian landscape. A deafening apocalyptic roar echoed across Pangaea as the ground shattered. From these colossal wounds, a wall of blinding radioactive magma erupted into the atmosphere. This was not a volcano. This was a flood basalt event, the birth of the Siberian Traps. Imagine a tidal wave of molten rock glowing a furious, blinding orange, surging across the landscape at terrifying speeds. The sheer volume of lava was incomprehensible. It was enough to bury the entire United States under a layer of solid rock several miles deep. The immediate devastation was localized, but the cruelty of the universe lies in its patience. This eruption did not stop. It did not cool down after a few weeks or months. The Siberian Traps continuously vomited liquid fire and toxic gases into the atmosphere for hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of years. It was a bleeding, pulsing wound on the face of the earth that refused to clot. Think about the absolute despair of the animals trapped on Pangaea. When a predator attacks, you run. When a storm approaches you, seek shelter in a cave. But where do you run when the entire surface of the planet becomes your executioner? There was no escape. The sky above them transformed into a bruised, sickening canopy of ash and sulfur. The sun, once a source of life-giving warmth, was blotted out by a thick, suffocating veil of darkness. The air grew heavy, hot, and corrosive. Every breath burned the lungs of the giant synapsids. The majestic gorgonopsids, the apex killers of their time, found their immense physical strength completely useless. Their powerful muscles could not fight off a cloud of toxic gas. Their razor-sharp fangs could not bite through a river of boiling lava. They wandered blindly through a darkening, burning world, their eyes stinging with ash, their bodies suffocating in a poisonous atmosphere. The psychological horror of an apex predator, realizing its absolute helplessness, is a tragedy written in fossilized bone. The terrestrial ecosystem collapsed in a wave of fire and ash. The lush fern forests were instantly incinerated into millions of tons of black soot that choked the rivers. The ground became blisteringly hot. The rivers boiled away into steam, leaving behind cracked, barren mudflats littered with the dying bodies of magnificent beasts. Animals died not just from the heat, but from the sheer toxicity of the air. The Siberian Traps released unfathomable quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and hydrogen chloride. When these gases mixed with the atmospheric moisture, they created highly concentrated, corrosive acid rain. This was not just rain that stung the skin. This was rain that melted the foliage right off the trees. Rain that turned freshwater lakes into pools of toxic acid, dissolving the shells of the amphibians and fish that sought refuge in them. The land was stripped bare, sterilized by fire from below and acid from above. Pangaea transformed from a vibrant supercontinent into a blackened, silent wasteland. The silence that followed the initial roaring of the fissures was the silence of a massive planetary grave. Only the crackle of cooling lava and the hiss of acid rain hitting hot rock remained. The absolute indifference of the cosmos was on full display. The universe did not care about the millions of years of evolutionary progress. It did not mourn the loss of the majestic beasts. It simply allowed the geological clockwork to grind everything into dust. But the horror was not confined to the land. The true scale of the Great Dying, the reason it is the most catastrophic event in the history of our planet, is what happened when the toxic breath of the Siberian Traps met the Great Global Ocean. The heat of the eruptions combined with the massive greenhouse effect of the released gases caused the global temperature to spike dramatically. The oceans, the cradle of all life, began to absorb this immense unnatural heat. The waters warmed to bath like temperatures, destroying the delicate thermal balance that sustained the spectacular marine ecosystems. The vibrant coral reefs, the bustling communities of trilobites, the giant sea scorpions, all found themselves trapped in a rapidly heating, highly acidic cauldron. 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species were wiped out by the fires, the ash, and the acid. But the slaughter in the ocean was mathematically terrifying. 96% of all marine life was systematically eradicated. It is the closest the Earth has ever come to being completely sterilized. The universe had unleashed a firestorm of unimaginable scale, melting the Earth and boiling the seas. But the physical destruction was only the first phase of this apocalypse. As the fires of the Siberian Traps continued to burn, they awakened something else, something invisible, something microscopic, a biological nightmare that would feed on the rotting corpse of the world and finish the job that the lava had started. The fire had broken the planet, but the true invisible eater of worlds was about to emerge from the boiling shadows. The greatest predator of the Great Dying had no fangs, it had no claws, it was entirely invisible, and it ate the rest of the world alive. We naturally assume that the beasts at the top of the food chain dictate the rules of survival. But when the Siberian Traps ripped the crust of the Earth open, they did not just unleash a localized firestorm. They altered the fundamental chemistry of the entire atmosphere. The lava was merely the match that lit the fuse. The true executioner was a microscopic entity that fed upon the rotting corpse of the planet. Imagine the devastated landscape of Pangaea thousands of years after the initial eruptions. The rivers of molten rock have largely cooled into vast, desolate plains of black basalt. But the nightmare is far from over. The immense volumes of carbon dioxide pumped into the air by the volcanoes have trapped the heat of the sun, creating a runaway greenhouse effect. The global temperature spikes by a staggering 10 degrees Celsius. To understand how lethal that is, realize that a shift of just 2 or 3 degrees today causes catastrophic weather anomalies. A 10-degree jump is not just a heat wave. It is a planetary fever that boils the life out of the biosphere. The equatorial regions of the supercontinent become literal dead zones. The ambient heat is so intense that proteins inside living cells begin to denature and cook. This extreme heat is accompanied by unrelenting toxic storms. The sulfur dioxide from the eruptions mixes with atmospheric water vapor to form a constant global drizzle of concentrated sulfuric acid. It strips the surviving vegetation down to the roots. It bleaches the land into a sterile skeletal gray. The giant synapsids, the few remaining gorgonopsids, and the herds of bulky tusked herbivores find themselves trapped in an inescapable hell. These are creatures built for physical domination. They have heavy bones, thick muscles, and ravenous metabolisms. But muscle and size are completely useless when the air itself is trying to kill you. They wander aimlessly across the cracked, blistering mud, their massive bodies covered in acid burns, their lungs violently coughing up blood and ash. There is no prey left to hunt. There are no plants left to graze. The absolute tragedy of these titans is that their evolutionary success, their immense size, has become their greatest vulnerability. They require too many calories and too much oxygen to survive in a world that has been stripped of both. You can picture a lone, starving gorgonopsid collapsing by the edge of a stagnant, evaporating pool of water. It is the last of its lineage, a magnificent biological killing machine reduced to a trembling, emaciated skeleton. Its heavy chest heaves in the sweltering, toxic air. It looks out over the desolate landscape, completely unable to comprehend the cosmic joke that has rendered its strength obsolete. It dies slowly, agonizingly suffocated by the heat and poisoned by the rain. And as its massive carcass begins to rot under the bruised, hazy sky, the true victor of the Permian extinction emerges from the shadows. While the giant lords of the land are starving to death, a single-celled organism smaller than a speck of dust is throwing a planetary feast. Its name is Methanosarcina. It is an archaeon, a primitive microscopic entity that thrives in environments lacking oxygen. For millions of years, Methanosarcina had been a marginal player in the ecosystem, quietly hiding in the oxygen-starved mud at the bottom of the oceans and swamps. But the Siberian Traps changed everything. The volcanic eruptions spewed unimaginable quantities of nickel directly into the environment. And nickel happens to be the exact rare nutrient that Methanosarcina needs to supercharge its metabolism. Suddenly, the oceans and the stagnant terrestrial pools become a limitless, all-you-can-eat buffet for these microscopic scavengers. The warm, oxygen-deprived, nickel-rich waters are the perfect breeding ground. They multiply at a terrifying, exponential rate. They consume the endless rain of dead organic matter, the billions of tons of rotting plants and decaying animal corpses that litter the globe. And as they eat, they exhale, but they do not exhale carbon dioxide. They exhale methane. Methane is a greenhouse gas exponentially more potent than carbon dioxide in trapping atmospheric heat. Trillions upon trillions of these invisible bacteria pump gargantuan clouds of methane directly into the oceans and the air. The water itself begins to bubble and froth with toxic gas. The oceans turn a sickly, vibrant purple and pink colored by the massive blooming mats of bacteria taking over the surface. It is a visually stunning, deeply disturbing portrait of a dying world. The pink stagnant seas are entirely devoid of oxygen, choked by hydrogen sulfide and methane. The marine ecosystems that survived the initial volcanic warming are now completely suffocated by this bacterial blanket. The methane released by Methanosarcina acts as an accelerant to the global fever. The planet gets even hotter. The permafrost melts, releasing even more trapped methane. The deep ocean methane hydrates destabilize and violently erupt to the surface, causing the seas to physically boil with gas. It is a deadly, unbreakable feedback loop of catastrophic warming. The Earth is locked in a death spiral entirely orchestrated by a microbe that does not have a brain, does not have eyes, and does not even realize it is destroying its own host planet. This is the ultimate humiliation of the complex biological organism. We like to imagine the history of life as a constant upward trajectory toward greater complexity, size, and intelligence. But the end of the Permian proves that when the universe decides to reshuffle the deck, the meek do not just inherit the earth. The meek eat the mighty alive. The microscopic outlasts the magnificent. The gorgonopsid dies whining in the mud, while the invisible Methanosarcina conquers the globe without taking a single physical step. The Earth had been reduced to a rotting, superheated rock, ruled entirely by toxic slime. The planet was clinically dead. The slate was wiped clean. 95% of everything that had ever lived was gone. Yet buried deep within the ashes, hiding in the darkest, coolest crevices of a shattered supercontinent, a tiny, shivering spark of complex life somehow managed to endure the unendurable. It waited out the toxic pink oceans and the acid rain. And when the Earth finally began to cool, it stepped out into a completely empty alien world, ready to start the brutal game of survival all over again. But the cosmic executioner was already planning its next masterpiece of destruction, preparing to physically tear the ground out from beneath their feet. Every line on the world map you see today, every beautiful coastline and every deep ocean trench was actually drawn in the blood of billions of creatures that died terribly 201 million years ago. We tend to look at mountains and oceans as majestic, peaceful features of our planet. We paint them. We write poems about them. But we completely forget that planetary geology is a ruthless butcher. The birth of the Atlantic Ocean was not a beautiful miracle of nature. It was a planetary-scale slaughterhouse operation. The universe had proven it could burn the world from above and suffocate it from below. Now it was going to physically tear the ground out from under the feet of the survivors. It took the Earth 10 million grueling years just to wash the pink, toxic bacterial slime from its oceans after the Great Dying. 10 million years of agonizing silent recovery. But by the late Triassic period, life had finally clawed its way back from the absolute brink of total annihilation. The single massive supercontinent of Pangaea was breathing again. The air was breathable. The skies had cleared. Lush, towering conifer forests and vast fern prairies had replaced the burned, sterile wastelands. A new dynasty of magnificent beasts had risen from the ashes to claim the empty thrones of the world. These were the Crurotarsans. Imagine massive, heavily armored reptiles that look like crocodiles on steroids, some standing as tall as a modern horse stalking through the ancient undergrowth with heavy, confident footsteps. They were the undisputed apex kings of the Triassic world. They ruled with brute force and heavily scaled armor. Alongside them, scurrying nervously in the dark shadows of the giant ferns, were the very first primitive dinosaurs. At this point in history, dinosaurs were nothing but small, fast, insignificant underdogs. They were the scavengers, the prey desperately trying to avoid being crushed or eaten by the giant reptilian warlords. The world seemed to have found a stable, thriving rhythm. The Triassic kings felt secure. The earth beneath their heavy claws felt solid, permanent, and eternal. But the cosmos does not do stable. The earth is a restless, violent, heat-driven machine, and Pangaea had grown too large. The massive supercontinent, like a giant insulating blanket over the mantle of the earth, trapping an unimaginable amount of internal planetary heat. The planet desperately needed to vent, and it chose to relieve that pressure by ripping itself right down the middle. Imagine standing in the center of a vast, silent Triassic forest at midnight. The air is perfectly still. The moonlight casts long, eerie shadows through the towering pine branches. There is no warning. There is no gradual buildup. Suddenly, the ground does not just shake. It physically, violently separates. A deafening, bone-rattling crack echoes across thousands of miles, a sound so loud it ruptures the eardrums of every living creature in its path. A colossal chasm opens up directly beneath your feet, plunging down into the glowing, churning guts of the earth. This was the activation of the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. It was a volcanic rift system so unimaginably huge that it physically tore Pangaea in half. Massive fissures, yawning canyons of glowing red heat, spiderwebbed across the landscape, stretching from what is now modern-day Brazil all the way across to France and Morocco. The ancient, heavily armored reptiles, the lords of the Triassic, did not understand what was happening. Their brains were wired to hunt, to fight, and to mate. They had absolutely no biological defense mechanism against the ground simply vanishing. Entire herds of magnificent, terrifying beasts were swallowed whole, tumbling, screaming into abysses of boiling liquid rock. The ocean waters from the Panthalassic Sea rushed violently into these glowing red rifts, instantly boiling upon contact with the magma and erupting into towering, scalding columns of toxic steam that reached into the stratosphere. But the physical tearing of the continent was only the localized immediate slaughter. The true global executioner was what came out of those rifts. The erupting magma baked the deep carbon-rich rocks of the continental crust, releasing catastrophic, unfathomable volumes of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide directly into the atmosphere. The Earth went from a stable, warm greenhouse to a suffocating hyperthermal pressure cooker in the blink of a geological eye. The skies turned a bruised, sickening shade of purple, completely choked with toxic volcanic ash and heavy gases. The sun became a hazy, pale ghost, entirely hidden behind a thick, suffocating veil of planetary poison. Imagine the absolute suffocating despair of the great Triassic predators. The giant crocodile-like hunters lay panting in the dry dust, their heavy, unyielding armor acting like a natural oven, baking their internal organs in the skyrocketing global heat. They dragged their massive, starving bodies toward ancient riverbeds that were rapidly boiling away into toxic, foul-smelling steam. The sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere reacted violently with the humidity, creating torrential, unrelenting downpours of highly concentrated acid rain. The lush, vibrant conifer forests withered and died almost overnight. Their needles burned black, their massive trunks stripped bare and bleached by the corrosive sky. The giant herbivorous reptiles starved by the millions, their stomachs completely empty, their lungs burning and bleeding with every single breath of the toxic air. And as the prey animals died out, the great predators turned on each other in a frenzy of starving, desperate madness, fighting to the death over rotting poison carcasses in a dying, darkening world. The nightmare inevitably bled into the oceans. The massive influx of volcanic carbon dioxide dissolved rapidly into the seawater, turning the shallow coastal shelves into vast vats of corrosive lethal acid. The coral reefs, which had painstakingly rebuilt themselves over tens of millions of years, were dissolved alive. Their intricate calcium carbonate skeletons simply melted away into the darkening, suffocating water. Giant marine reptiles choked, thrashed in agony, and sank to the freezing dead bottom of a poisoned sea. 80% of all species on Earth were systematically eradicated in this violent geographical birthing process. The majestic dominant reptiles of the Triassic were completely wiped from the face of the planet. Their powerful lineage was severed forever. The universe had once again executed the kings of the world. But in the grand, cold, calculating logic of evolution, one creature's apocalypse is always another creature's golden ticket. The giant Triassic predators had occupied all the top spots in the food chain, keeping the smaller, faster animals ruthlessly in check. When the world ripped itself apart and the air turned to poison, the massive caloric requirements and heavy bodies of the Triassic kings became their ultimate death sentence. But what about those small, nimble, seemingly insignificant underdogs scurrying in the shadows? The ones that could survive on tiny scraps, hide in deep, cool burrows, and run fast enough to escape the advancing lava flows in the suffocating heat. They survived the tearing of the world. They emerged from the ashes of the fractured supercontinent, stepping out into a completely empty, silent, and desolate landscape. The throne of the world was empty. The giant, terrifying wardens were all dead. The stage was finally set for the most famous, spectacular, and ultimately tragic dynasty in the entire history of our planet. The age of the dinosaurs had officially begun, built entirely upon the charred, broken, and acid-washed bones of their predecessors. The universe had cleared the biological board once again, deliberately setting up the pieces for a magnificent reign that would last a staggering 165 million years. A reign of unparalleled biological dominance that would ultimately end in the most spectacular, explosive, and cinematic execution imaginable. The heavens were already taking aim. The undisputed masters of this planet enjoyed 165 million years of absolute invincible dominance. But the universe only needed one single morning to erase it all. And that morning began with a silence so profound it was utterly terrifying. Welcome to the late Cretaceous period, roughly 66 million years ago. If you could somehow transport yourself back in time and stand in the lush, steaming jungles of this era, you would feel an overwhelming, suffocating sense of biological perfection. The Earth was a paradise of monumental proportions. The climate was incredibly warm and stable, stretching all the way to the polar regions. There were no freezing ice caps to hold back the oceans. The atmosphere was rich, thick, and pulsating with vibrant life. And ruling over this global greenhouse world were the ultimate unparalleled products of terrestrial evolution. The dinosaurs. Forget everything you know about human history. Our entire existence as a species, all our empires and wars and technological triumphs, is barely a microscopic blip compared to the reign of these magnificent titans. For 165 million years, they adapted, they diversified, and they ruthlessly conquered every single ecological niche on the continents. They grew to sizes that completely defy modern imagination and physics. Imagine the ground physically trembling beneath the weight of a 70-ton sauropod, a creature so massive that its heart had to pump blood at pressures that would burst human vessels. Picture the terrifying, cold, calculated intelligence of a pack of feathered dromaeosaurs hunting silently in the dense ferns, coordinating their attacks like military squads. And envision the undisputed terrifying king of the continent, the Tyrannosaurus rex. It was a biological killing machine, so perfectly engineered by millions of years of evolution that it had absolutely no natural predators. With jaws capable of crushing solid bone into dust, it was the apex of the apex. This is the great tragic illusion of life. When you reach the absolute top of the food chain, when your body is practically invincible, armored with thick scales, armed with lethal claws, and backed by a staggering genetic heritage of successful survival, you feel fundamentally immortal. The dinosaurs had won the game of planetary survival. They survived the slow grinding shifting of the tectonic plates. They survived subtle changes in the global climate. They were the unquestioned gods of a green, flourishing world. They possessed a biological perfection that makes our fragile, soft human bodies look like a tragic evolutionary joke. But biological perfection is a purely terrestrial concept. Evolution only prepares you for the dangers of the dirt beneath your feet, the water you drink, and the air you breathe. It does not look up. It absolutely does not prepare you for the cold, calculating, and entirely random violence of the infinite cosmos. While the great kings of the Cretaceous were busy fighting over territory, eating, breeding, and securing their legacy, the universe was silently rolling the cosmic dice. Millions of miles away in the freezing, silent, pitch-black vacuum of deep space, a mountain of solid rock and heavy metals was tumbling blindly through the dark. It was roughly 6 miles across, a jagged, ugly piece of primordial cosmic debris left over from the very violent birth of the solar system. It had no mind. It had no target. It was completely indifferent to the magnificent, breathing, blue and green paradise it was hurtling toward. It was simply obeying the blind, unyielding, and emotionless laws of gravity and momentum. For countless millions of years, this massive asteroid had drifted aimlessly in the cold void. But a subtle gravitational nudge, perhaps a microscopic pull from the massive planet Jupiter, altered its trajectory just a fraction of a single degree. That microscopic, invisible shift sealed the absolute fate of the dinosaurs. The rock was now locked onto a direct, inescapable collision course with Earth. It was traveling at a mind-bending speed of 45,000 miles per hour. That is roughly 20 times faster than a high-powered rifle bullet. It was moving so fast that it was crossing the vast emptiness of space with terrifying efficiency. And because it was traveling through the total vacuum of the cosmos, it made absolutely no sound. Now bring your focus back down to the surface of the Earth. It is a beautiful, remarkably clear morning on the shores of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in modern-day Mexico. The air is thick with heavy humidity and the sweet smell of early blooming, primitive flowering plants. The ocean is perfectly calm, a massive mirror reflecting the golden light of the rising sun. Pterosaurs, massive flying reptiles with leathery wingspans the size of small airplanes, are riding the gentle, warm thermal currents high above the sparkling coastal water. In the dense, vibrant coastal forests, a massive Tyrannosaurus rex steps quietly out of the deep shadows. Its heavy, calloused foot crushes a rotting log into the damp soil. It breathes in the damp morning air, surveying its vast kingdom. It is powerful, it is hungry, it is completely, utterly safe. But then something strange and terrible happens in the sky. High above the green canopy, a second sun suddenly appears. It is a brilliant, blinding point of light, far brighter and harsher than the actual sun. It does not make a sound. It does not disturb the gentle morning wind. It simply hangs there in the blue sky, glowing with an unnatural, furious, and rapidly expanding intensity. The Tyrannosaurus rex stops its patrol. It raises its massive, heavily scarred head and stares directly at the strange, beautiful light. It does not feel fear. Its highly evolved reptilian brain has absolutely no concept of astronomy. It has no genetic memory or instinctual dread of falling stars. It simply watches the bright anomaly in the sky, completely unaware that it is looking directly into the unforgiving eyes of the cosmic executioner. The silence of that specific morning is the most deeply unsettling and heartbreaking part of the entire extinction event. The dinosaurs were living in the final fleeting seconds of their magnificent existence, entirely oblivious to the fact that their hourglass had run completely empty. The asteroid hit the very uppermost edge of the Earth's atmosphere and instantly began to burn due to the extreme friction turning the sky into a vivid, terrifying streak of white-hot plasma. Still, for a few agonizing suspended heartbeats, the sheer speed of the rock outpaced the sound of its own atmospheric entry. The sound had not yet reached the ground. The world remained peacefully, tragically quiet. The great invincible beasts of the Cretaceous stood frozen, mesmerized by the magnificent deadly light show in the heavens. They had successfully survived everything the planet Earth could possibly throw at them for 165 million years. But they were about to learn the ultimate horrifying truth of our existence. You can master the Earth. You can become the most powerful and feared entity breathing the air, but you are still just a microscopic, fragile bug sitting on a wet rock, completely at the mercy of a vast, unfeeling, and deeply violent universe. The silence held for one more fraction of a second, and then the sky physically fell. I always thought the exact moment of the cosmic impact was the absolute pinnacle of terror. But the reality that followed a bleeding red sky vomiting a relentless storm of molten glass was the true definition of hell on Earth. When the 6-mile-wide asteroid pierced the thin veil of our atmosphere, it did not just push the air out of its way. It was moving so incredibly fast that the air beneath it could not escape. The atmosphere was violently compressed, creating a cushion of superheated plasma that glowed brighter than the surface of the sun. The sheer kinetic energy of this cosmic bullet was completely unfathomable. It was a silent, unfeeling delivery mechanism for a level of destruction that breaks the human mind. The moment it made contact with the shallow tropical waters of the Yucatan Peninsula, the history of our planet was permanently fractured. This was not a localized explosion. It was the sudden, catastrophic transfer of universal momentum directly into the delicate crust of the Earth. The energy released in that single fraction of a second was equivalent to 10 billion Hiroshima atomic bombs detonating simultaneously in one specific point. Think about that for a moment. 10 billion nuclear weapons going off at the exact same millisecond. Everything within a 1,000-mile radius of the impact zone ceased to exist. They did not burn. They did not drown. They were instantaneously vaporized. The mighty Tyrannosaurus Rex that had just looked up at the strange second sun was reduced to scattering atoms before the nerve endings in its skin could even send a signal of pain to its brain. The colossal sauropods, the heavily armored triceratops, the vibrant coastal forests, and millions of gallons of ocean water were simply deleted from reality. The solid bedrock of the Earth was instantly liquefied and gouged out, creating a crater 20 miles deep and over 100 miles wide. The planet literally rang like a shattered bell. The seismic waves generated by the impact were so unimaginably violent that they traveled entirely through the core of the Earth, fracturing tectonic plates and triggering massive catastrophic volcanic eruptions on the exact opposite side of the globe in a region known as the Deccan Traps. It was a perfectly coordinated planetary assault. A supersonic shockwave of compressed, searing air expanded outward from the crater in a perfect, horrifying circle. This wall of sheer pressure traveled at thousands of miles per hour, leveling every single tree, ripping the soil from the bedrock, and flattening entire mountain ranges in its path. But this localized vaporization and crushing shockwave was actually a mercy compared to what the rest of the world was about to experience. This is where the true agonizing conflict between biological flesh and cosmic physics begins. The incredible evolutionary adaptations of the dinosaurs, their massive size, their thick, scaly armor, their sheer muscular power meant absolutely nothing in the face of pure, unadulterated kinetic energy. Flesh and bone cannot negotiate with a shockwave traveling at Mach 20. As the massive crater was gouged out, millions of tons of vaporized rock, ocean water, and sulfur-rich crust were blasted directly upward, tearing a massive hole straight through the atmosphere and erupting out into the cold vacuum of space. The immense ejecta plume expanded rapidly, wrapping the entire globe in a suffocating dark embrace. But gravity is a relentless, unforgiving master. What the asteroid blasted into space was eventually pulled back down by the mass of the Earth. Trillions of pieces of pulverized rock began to re-enter the atmosphere all around the planet simultaneously. As they fell, atmospheric friction superheated them. They turned into a ceaseless global shower of shooting stars. But there were so many of them, billions upon billions of incandescent meteors, that the sky from horizon to horizon became a solid, unbroken sheet of blinding plasma. The entire atmosphere of the Earth was physically transformed into a global broiler oven. The temperature at the surface spiked to hundreds of degrees within minutes. Imagine being a dinosaur on the exact opposite side of the planet in the lush green forests of what is now Mongolia, or the ancient Antarctic continent. You survived the initial terrifying earthquake. You survived the distant, deafening roar of the shockwave that rattled your bones. But a few hours later, you look up and the familiar blue sky is bleeding a terrifying incandescent red. The air grows searingly hot, burning your lungs with every desperate, gasping breath. The thermal radiation radiating down from the glowing sky is so intensely concentrated that the ancient fern forests all around you spontaneously burst into flames. There is no escape from the heat. There is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from a sky that has turned into a ceiling of fire. Then the molten glass begins to fall. Trillions of droplets of liquid rock, known to scientists as tektites, rain down upon the burning world like a biblical plague, searing through the thick skin and heavy armor of the terrified beasts. The dinosaurs, the undisputed invincible kings of the world, are burned alive by the very sky above them, in a chorus of agonizing screams that are swallowed by the roar of the global firestorm. And while the continents burn to ash, the oceans unleash their own apocalyptic fury upon the coastlines. Back near the impact zone, the violently displaced water rushed back in to fill the massive glowing crater. This catastrophic movement of water created a mega tsunami of incomprehensible, terrifying proportions. A literal wall of dark, churning water, thousands of feet high, and filled with the boiled corpses of massive marine reptiles and shattered blackened trees swept across the continents. It surged hundreds of miles inland, with the force of 1,000,000 freight trains violently washing away the burning forests and drowning any creature that had miraculously survived the global heat pulse. The collision at Chicxulub was a masterpiece of cosmic cruelty. It used every single element of the Earth against its inhabitants. The air became fire. The earth became glass. The water became a crushing hammer. The reign of the giant reptiles ended in a devastating symphony of deafening explosions, roaring fires, and crushing waves. But as the towering tsunamis receded and the global fires slowly died out, leaving behind a charred, smoking, completely silent wasteland, the true horror of the asteroid impact was just beginning to settle in. The sudden, violent execution was over, but the slow, agonizing starvation of the entire planet was about to plunge the Earth into an era of absolute freezing darkness. In the darkness and extreme cold, the invincible strength of the dinosaur became completely useless. The future of this entire planet now fell into the hands of a pathetic, shivering creature that only knew how to hide in the mud. The fires that ravaged the globe eventually burned themselves out, but the true apocalypse was just beginning. The asteroid strike at Chicxulub had vaporized billions of tons of sulfur-rich rock, blasting a colossal cloud of soot ash and toxic aerosols high into the stratosphere. This impenetrable blanket of pulverized planetary debris rapidly spread, wrapping the Earth in a suffocating atmospheric shroud. The sun, the great engine of all biological life, was completely blotted out. Day turned into a permanent freezing twilight. The world plunged into a brutal impact winter that would last for years, perhaps even decades. Imagine the sheer psychological terror of watching the light slowly die, replaced by an endless freezing night that simply refused to end. For 165 million years, the giant reptiles had basked in the warmth of a global greenhouse. Their biology was entirely dependent on abundant sunlight and massive quantities of food. But without the sun, the very foundation of the global food chain instantly collapsed. Photosynthesis, the silent miracle that turns light into life, ground to an absolute halt. The lush, vibrant forests that had somehow survived the initial firestorms now withered and turned to gray dust in the freezing dark. The towering canopy collapsed into a graveyard of dead, rotting wood, And with the death of the plants came the agonizing slow starvation of the herbivores. The magnificent horned dinosaurs and the colossal long-necked titans wandered blindly through the freezing ash, their massive stomachs rumbling with an unbearable gnawing emptiness. There is a profound, deeply unsettling paradox in this moment. The absolute pinnacle of evolutionary engineering, the most spectacular beasts to ever walk the earth, were brought to their knees not by a superior predator, but by simple, unrelenting hunger. Their gargantuan size, which had protected them from any earthly threat, now became a horrifying death sentence. A body that weighs 10 tons requires a staggering amount of calories just to keep its heart beating. In a world devoid of vegetation, these magnificent biological machines began to consume themselves from the inside out. Their massive muscles atrophied, their thick, armored skin draped loosely over their jutting skeletal frames. They collapsed into the freezing mud, too weak to even lift their heavy heads, and died in a silent, freezing whimper. And as the great plant eaters fell, the apex predators followed them into oblivion. The Tyrannosaurus rex, the undisputed tyrant, king of the Cretaceous, found its terrifying jaws completely useless. You cannot bite the cold. You cannot intimidate the darkness. You cannot hunt when the entire world is empty. The remaining carnivores fought desperate, bloody battles over the frozen, rotting carcasses of the fallen herbivores. But soon even the corpses were gone, buried under layers of toxic ash and dirty snow. The kings of the world froze to death in the shadows of their own ruined empire. 75% of all plant and animal species on Earth were systematically eradicated in this freezing, lightless hell. The grand sweeping cinematic reign of the dinosaurs ended not with a glorious final battle, but with a pathetic, shivering whimper in the dark. But the universe, in all its cold, calculating cruelty, always leaves a loophole. Evolution is not about perfection. It is about brutal, pragmatic adaptation. While the mighty titans were starving in the freezing winds, above a completely different story was unfolding deep beneath the charred, poisoned soil. Down in the dark, cramped, and damp burrows, the true inheritors of the earth were quietly waiting out the apocalypse. These were the early mammals, our direct ancestors. For millions of years, they had been nothing more than insignificant rat-like scavengers forced to live in the shadows and hunt only at night to avoid being crushed or eaten by the giant reptiles. They were small, they were hairy, they were entirely unheroic. Yet in this specific horrific scenario, their absolute insignificance was their greatest superpower. Their small, furry bodies required very few calories to survive. Their warm-blooded metabolism kept them insulated from the freezing impact winter. And most importantly, they were not picky eaters. To survive the end of the world, you do not need to be a magnificent hunter. You must be willing to abandon all dignity. You must be willing to eat anything. Our ancestors survived the nuclear winter by chewing on dead insects, digging up rotting fungus-covered roots, and feasting on the decaying frozen meat of the fallen dinosaur kings. They were the ultimate biological opportunists, thriving in the absolute worst conditions the universe could engineer. Imagine a tiny, ragged, shrew-like creature cautiously poking its whiskered snout out of a muddy hole. Above it, the sky is a bruised, terrifying expanse of swirling black ash. The ground is littered with the monumental frozen skeletons of creatures a million times its size. The wind howls through the empty rib cages of the fallen tyrants. The little mammal shivers in the freezing cold, its tiny heart beating rapidly in its chest. It scurries across the desolate landscape, its tiny claws clicking against the frozen bones, searching desperately for a dead beetle or a scrap of rotting flesh. This pathetic, desperate scene is not a tragedy. It is the greatest triumph in the history of biology. This is the moment the torch was passed. The universe had deliberately crushed the beautiful, the strong, and the majestic. It had humiliated the biological pinnacle of the planet, and in doing so, it handed the empty, ruined throne of the world over to the creatures of the dirt. This is the horrifying philosophical truth of our existence. We are not the descendants of the brave or the powerful. We are the direct descendants of the cowards who hid in the mud. We are the children of the scavengers who survived by eating the rotting garbage of a dead world. The dinosaurs failed because they were too specialized, too arrogant in their biological perfection. Our ancestors lived entirely because they were adaptable, resourceful, and willing to embrace the absolute filth of survival. As the decades slowly passed, the thick blanket of atmospheric ash finally began to thin. A weak, pale light pierced the darkness, touching the frozen, barren surface of the earth for the first time in a generation. The impact winter was ending. The ice began to melt, revealing a profoundly empty, devastated planet. The giant reptiles were gone forever, their bones destined to become nothing more than curiosities buried in the rock. But the small, furry creatures emerged from their dark, muddy burrows into the returning light. They blinked their tiny eyes at the new sun. The world was theirs now, an entirely blank canvas washed clean by fire and ice, ready for a new evolutionary dynasty to begin. But the cosmos was not finished with us. The universe had proven that it could easily wipe us out with a stray rock from the void. But for its final, most terrifying trick, the universe would not send a weapon from the stars. It would allow the survivors to become the weapon themselves. 5 times the universe was the ruthless assassin. It used invisible cosmic radiation. It used suffocating botanical roots. It used boiling continental lava. It used toxic microscopic slime. And it used a gargantuan, unfeeling rock from the dark void of space. But as we stand here today, looking out over our vast, interconnected technological empire, we must face a chilling reality. For the 6th time in the 4.5 billion-year history of this planet, the drums of mass extinction are beating loudly. But this time the Grim Reaper did not descend from the freezing heavens. It did not rise up from the boiling mantle. This time the executioner is staring right back at us from the mirror. Think about the incredible, miraculous journey of our lineage. We started as pathetic, shivering rat-like creatures hiding in the dark, muddy burrows, while the majestic dinosaur kings froze and starved to death in the impact winter. We inherited a shattered, empty world. Over 66 million years, we slowly crept out of the shadows. We grew larger. We grew smarter. We learned to walk upright on the sprawling African savannas. We learned to harness the power of fire, the very element that had once sterilized the continents. We survived brutal ice ages, we crossed freezing land bridges, and we conquered every single inhospitable corner of this globe. We built towering monuments of stone and glass. We split the fundamental atom. We sent pieces of metal into the cold vacuum of space, reaching out to touch the very stars that once threatened to annihilate us. We are without a single doubt the ultimate survivors. We are the absolute pinnacle of evolutionary adaptation. But here is the horrifying, inescapable paradox of human existence. In our desperate, brilliant struggle to survive the brutal forces of nature, we have become the exact thing we spent millions of years running away from. We have transformed from the hunted into the ultimate planetary catastrophe. Welcome to the Anthropocene, the human epic. It sounds like a title of magnificent triumph, but it is actually a formal declaration of war against the biosphere. The biological clock of the Earth is currently ticking down at a terrifying, unnatural speed. The background rate of extinction, the natural rhythm at which species slowly fade away over millions of years, has been completely shattered. Right now, because of our relentless, insatiable hunger for resources, species are vanishing from this planet 1,000 to 10,000 times faster than they ever did before human civilization existed. We look back at the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs with a sense of cosmic dread. But we fail to realize that humanity is acting as a slow-motion asteroid strike right this very second. The 6-mile-wide rock that hit the Yucatan Peninsula caused a catastrophic disruption of the atmosphere. We are doing the exact same thing, not in a single afternoon, but over the course of a few short centuries. We are aggressively pumping billions of tons of ancient, trapped carbon out of the ground and straight into the fragile atmosphere, recreating the exact same suffocating greenhouse conditions that triggered the Great Dying 252 million years ago. We are dumping millions of tons of synthetic chemicals and toxic agricultural runoff into the oceans, deliberately engineering the same anoxic, suffocating dead zones that wiped out the armored fish of the Devonian period. We are cutting down the vast ancient rainforests, stripping the lungs of the earth with the same ruthless efficiency as the acid rains of the Triassic apocalypse. If you could somehow detach yourself from your human perspective and look down at the Earth from low orbit in the dead of night, you would see a magnificent network of glowing golden lights stretching across the dark continents. It looks beautiful. It looks like the ultimate triumph of civilization over the dark. But if you observe it with the cold, objective logic of an evolutionary biologist, those sprawling megacities do not look like a triumph. They look exactly like a bioluminescent fungus, a rapidly spreading parasitic mold aggressively consuming its host. We are consuming the land, draining the fresh water, and devouring the immense biological diversity of the planet with the exact same mindless, terrifying efficiency as the methane-producing bacteria that rotted the world during the Permian extinction. The sheer tragedy of our current situation is our awareness. The dinosaurs did not know the asteroid was coming. The heavily armored fish did not understand why the oceans were running out of air. They died in absolute terrified ignorance. But we know exactly what we are doing. We possess the staggering scientific intellect to perfectly reconstruct the 5 previous apocalypses, yet we are actively, consciously choosing to pull the trigger on the 6th. We have outsmarted the cold, uncaring cosmos only to find that we cannot outsmart our own biological greed. The universe does not need to send another gamma ray burst. It does not need to wake up a supervolcano. It is simply sitting back in the cold, dark void, silently watching us perfectly execute our own demise. We are the asteroid. We are the lava. We are the poison. And we are writing our own death sentence with every single breath we take. The story of life on Earth is a majestic, brutal symphony of survival, but the final movement is yet to be played. Will we be the first species in the history of the universe to consciously step back from the absolute brink of total annihilation? Or will we simply become another layer of dark, fossilized ash buried deep in the rock, a cautionary tale for whatever strange burrowing creature inherits the ashes of our empire? The clock is ticking and the silence of the cosmos is deafening. But do not think the horror ends here. The Earth has many more secrets buried in its dark, frozen corners. Next week, we are going to tear open the ice of the deepest, most isolated continent on the planet to uncover a biological mystery so terrifying it will make you question everything you know about the origins of life itself. You absolutely do not want to miss this revelation, so make sure you subscribe to our channel right now. The truth is hiding in the dark, and we are going to drag it out into the light.